6. The Babel state. The goal of bramble men is back to Babel. With this in mind, let us look again at Genesis chapter 11, verses 1 to 9. We are told, "The whole earth was of one language and of one speech." The word one used there and in verse 6 differs from that used in verses 3 and 7 in the Hebrew original. It is echad, meaning united. The whole earth was united in a common anti-God purpose. Hence, Rabbi Myers-Lotowitz translated the sentence, "The whole earth was of one language and of common purpose." Again, the word language in verses 1, 6, 7, and 9 is the Hebrew sapha, lip, which may be from kapha, to scrape together, that is, to accumulate or to increase. As a result, another reading is possible. One language and of one speech is a common form of Hebrew stress by repetition. On the other hand, it can mean a reference to common possessions as well as a common language. Abarbanel, or Isaac ben Judah Abarbanel, 1477 to 1508, saw this as a reference to the absence of private property. There was thus both a common language and a common ownership of all things. While there can be no certainty on this point, there is some reason to agree with Abarbanel. The goal of Babel was a radical unity against God and a unified social order. It was a first example of what Plato set forth in his Republic, the socialist state. The goal was total community without God. The Garden of Eden had fixed borders. Cain, very early, built a city, again a bordered and protected area. Cain, feeling his guilt, felt the need for protection. The text of Genesis chapter 4, verse 17 tells us literally, he became a city builder. Attention is thereby called to his personality rather than to his work. By his city building, Cain was, in effect, engaged in warfare against God and man. He had settled in the land of Nod, which means wandering, perpetually wandering through it without rest. The hostility manifest in Cain appears also in his descendant Lamech, Genesis chapter 4, verses 19 to 24, whose creed was vengeance and death. James chapter 4, verses 1 to 4, makes plain that the origin of warfare and troubles is in sin. Man's hostility to man has its roots in his rebellion against God and his insistence that, as his own God, his will must be done. As a result, the godly live in a warring world in which they are at times caught up in the warring actions of evil men. As David said, "I am for peace, but when I speak, they are for war." Psalm 120, verse 7. The goal of fallen man is unity after the model of Babel, a substitute for Eden. At the same time, man's sin isolates him from other men, each man being his own God. To be held by another as a friend is resented by such men. When a California Christian school began to distribute food to needy families recently, some refused to accept the gifts on learning that it was not a statist grant. Their premise was that state or federal relief is a right, whereas Christian giving is charity, and hence degrading. Shook summed up this attitude in a telling quotation, "Whoever helps me is my enemy." Such an attitude is all too prevalent today. To take by fraud is acceptable because it is seen as a demonstration of superiority. But charity reveals humanity in the donor and recipient, a recognition of a creaturely condition. As Shook noted, the envious man is, by definition, the negation of the basis of any society. Thus, where bramble men are in power, when men are both envious and self-righteous about their envy, and when a society begins to use its powers politically, that is, to aggrandize power rather than economically, to produce, develop, and expand, the new Babels arise to bring in fresh confusion and destruction. Envy then becomes the basis for both politics and law, so that the state created by bramble men deserts justice for social justice, which is another term for power and envy legitimated. This Babel state then seeks control rather than justice, because controls become the means of exercising its envy and power. We have been describing the modern state, a Babel state. Its destiny is confusion. John Lukács, in analysing our modern 20th century world, says, "The greatest states, having accumulated unequalled powers, suddenly have found that they are becoming powerless. No tyrant states of the past had powers as great as are routine for modern states." Lukács sees the world in a contradictory phase. Integration contradicted by disintegration. In the name of justice, truth is being bypassed and undermined. Lukács calls attention to the very different perspective of the American Puritans, who saw science and intellect as instruments to further man's dominion under God. Cotton Mather, in 1723, called for the cultivation of science and inventions to put the world in much better circumstances than it is in. We try for machines to render the wind as well as the water serviceable to us and extend our empire into all the elements. Such a goal rested on man under God, exercising the implication of God's image in man in terms of the dominion mandate. The Babel state seeks instead to control, not to advance. It seeks a false and ungodly dominion grounded in power, not work, science and inventions. The result is the pursuit of power in politics and economics, of ugliness in the arts, and of emptiness in everyday life. This ungodly dominion is one of negation, of hostility to God. As Camus said, "Since God claims all that is good in man, it is necessary to deride what is good and choose what is evil." In terms of this inversion, power replaced work as the driving force in the Babel state. Bramble men regard work as the task of slaves. The philosopher kings exercise power. The slaves work. The production demanded by the Babel states is directed towards its self-exaltation, towards the conquest of other states, other peoples, and its own people. Production in the Soviet Union and Red China only marginally, at best, works to the advancement of the people. The welfare of the state and its rulers is the primary goal. We saw earlier that a possible and perhaps likely meaning of Genesis chapter 11 verse 1 is that the whole earth had a common language and a common ownership of all things. That is, that Babel was a communist society. There is another interesting aspect to this narrative. In Genesis chapter 11 verse 4, the men of Babel say, "Let us build a city and a tower." In verse 8, we are told that they stopped building work well before its completion. On the other hand, in verse 5, God speaks of the city and tower in the past tense, saying, "Let us see the city and the tower which the children of men builded," or which the sons of men built. God viewed the work at Babel, although far from complete, as in effect completed, because it was an evil intention in process of realization. At Babel, men resumed the task in process before the flood. At Sodom and Gomorrah, Assyria, Babylon, Rome, and in the modern states, men continue that task. The results are still the same. God's destroying judgment on man's Babylonian heart and works. The things which are, God subjects to his shaking, his destroying judgments, so that only those things which cannot be shaken may remain. Hebrews chapter 12, verses 18 to 29. Man's attempt to unify man in his sin and revolt against God, and to take over ownership and control over all possessions from their true owner, God, is smashed. All possessions are a trust from the Lord. The status of civil governments is that of a minister. Romans chapter 13, verse 4, etc. That is, a deacon or steward under God, and the same is true of all men. This being the case, our work, too, is a stewardship and a trusteeship, and is to be governed accordingly. When God created Adam and set him in the Garden of Eden, he first commanded Adam to till or work the garden, and to keep or guard it. Genesis chapter 2, verse 15. Only after that commandment to work is Adam told what he is permitted to eat. Genesis chapter 2, verses 16 and 17. Before the permission to eat of the fruits and produce came the necessity of being committed to work for the upkeep of the garden. There were boundaries placed on Adam's area, that is, the limits of the garden, on his diet, and on his activities or work, because the earth and Adam were alike God's creation, and hence totally subject to his law word. In Babel, this order was reversed. The city, its tower, and both work and possessions therein were the property of Babel. Stewardship and responsibility were to the state, and work also. In the modern state, we are totally circumscribed by man's law, not God's. The boundaries of our life and work, as well as the uses of our money, are regulated by the state. This is the nature of every Tower of Babel, past and present. The future of all Babels is described by the angel of Revelation chapter 14, verse 8. Babylon is fallen, that great city, because she made all nations drink of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. The Church, at its worst, has never equalled the modern state in its tyranny. It is a mark of the self-willed blindness of our time that men profess to fear a return to Christian rule rather than the statist tyranny which prevails. A final note. Why has Aberbanel's rendering of the text not received more consideration? It is a textual question, but can other considerations lead to other interpretations? Plato is, after all, a much honoured man among scholars, and academicians have always been prone to give weight to the idols of the academy. To illustrate the foibles of the academy, many scholars cringe when they hear or read the term biblical archaeology. One scholar, in reviewing Lucas H. Grollenberg's Atlas of the Bible, 1959, complains of Grollenberg's occasional theological viewpoints. He cites as an example of a statement that many readers will find offensive, and calls it a highly questionable historical statement that Grollenberg should comment. But for the Christians, the destruction of the temple was a material confirmation of a spiritual certainty. For them, the glory of Yahweh no longer dwelt in the temple in Jerusalem, but in the glorified body of Jesus. The building destroyed by the Roman legions had lost all meaning and purpose with the glorification of Jesus. Another example. Eric V. Gritch in Born Againism, Perspectives on a Movement, published by Fortress, a religious press, in 1982, confesses at the outset to some perplexity about what is meant by born-againism, but decides that it amounts to something like the fusion of millennialist and perfectionist strains of American Protestantism. Reviewer Balmer sees Gritch's book as competent, if uninspiring. How competent can a book be which cannot identify what it writes, especially something so clearly stated in Scripture and in theological and popular writings. Of the absurdities and pomposities of academic, quote, scholarship, end quote, there is no end.